episode 35 of the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's guest is Aaron Wood. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Aaron Wood is a purveyor of propaganda for the masses, an artist who loves baseball and bacon, a co-host on the Geek League of America, and a longtime conductor of player-enhanced interrogations, aka a DM. Hello, Aaron. Is there anything else you'd like people to know about you?
Well, let's see, Jeff. I've got tons of DM experience when it comes to world building and stuff like that. Since this is a world building anvil show, figured I'd throw that in there too. I was always the person that people turned to create the worlds and to run the stories when we did RPGs and stuff like that. Very rarely I found myself actually as a character. I was usually the one in charge of giving the adventures and the stories to the other characters. I'm a freelance graphic designer right now. I've been doing a lot of book cover work, all types of genres, from murder mysteries to sci-fi to superheroes, and just being creative as much as I can.
Excellent. So how do you feel today? Do you feel orc or elf?
Oh, definitely very elf-like, a little brooding, but a little creative, somewhere in there.
Now, is this an elf quest kind of elf or a token elf?
kind of Tolkien elf when they look to the ships to retire, so
very good. All right, so tell me a little bit about the latest thing that you've been working on.
Oh, let's see. The latest thing that I've been working on. There's been a few freelance projects that I've been doing lately for people's logos and stuff. I recently got contracted to do a piece for an article on I think it was the people of Kenya using Facebook for some kind of social benefit kind of thing, and that was pretty cool. And of course, everyone loves my propaganda style, so they wanted it in that kind of propaganda style. The logo that I did, almost when I feel like when I'm doing logo work, I am kind of world building because I'm designing this look that will encompass this whole business, so I'm designing that skeletal framework that everything gets built off of, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I did that recently, for a company called Succinct. A friend of mine contacted me and wanted to work with me. And then one other cool project I've been working on, for my buddy's, blog, he wanted me to do, hand-drawn illustrations for it. Something a little bit different than what you see. A lot of blogs these days have, sunsets and seascapes and landscapes and stuff. He's like, well, let's go against the norm and throw, or some stock photography. Let's throw in some hand-drawn illustrations. So
that's cute.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's an interesting thing, too, because I think one of the things people fail to understand is how useful the world builder skill set is. It lets you abstract things. It lets you start to piece things together in a logical manner that are a little outside of your own norm. And personally, just as a full disclosure here to everyone out there, when I'm a big-time writer and I'm releasing gazetteers of all my countries, I'll probably have propaganda posters built by this individual here for each of my countries, so you know how wonderful they are and why you want to live there.
That's right.
Okay. So, specifically to world building now, when you're telling a story, how do you tie the world building elements into the story for your players without this sort of, pointing out pointless facts that just, make your world sound cool because you spent way too much time thinking about it. But how do you connect it back to the story when you're DMing?
It's tough to keep that constant tie going, because as you're playing, the characters often do, the PCs often do things that you don't count on them doing. So you kind of have to almost build your world and then rebuild it on the fly. I like to populate my worlds with a bunch of colorful NPCs, and that lets me, kind of bring this personality right to the world. I could sit there and make up the lore behind the world, like, okay, this type of magic exists and this type of magic doesn't, or they're heavily into swordplay or whatever. But then you actually have to create the people that populate the world, I feel, to interact with these PCs. And that's where I really thrive on is getting that interaction going, anywhere from a shopkeeper in a shop to some street urchin in the street that might be selling information or something like that.
So more specifically about that, a lot of times players and readers have the perspective that they've lived in the world. How do you treat it especially when you're doing an interactive story like that, to try and get them in line with the customs as they should be where they're at and their character should know, versus their own inclinations to slap the bartender across the face?
That too is tough, Jeff, because I've played with all sorts of types of people who had no background in role playing to people who were very, very story centric. They loved the storylines and to follow them to the letter. So when you get somebody that hasn't really role played before, they might take a swipe at the bartender. They might, they might want to go off and leave the party and go on their own specific route. And it's your job to kind of rein them in and wrangle them. And, maybe you give them the choice. Okay, do you really want to do this or not? And if they do, then you have to really go with it, because you never want to really be a rules lawyer and stifle creativity. But there are certain limits where you have to just yank on the leash and say, come on, guys, this is getting detrimental to the main storyline. And I find that some role play sessions can be kind of meandering and wandering. I like to kind of set those goals where party meets, party adventures, party does main objective, which is very cliche, but along the way, I like to have it be like the Baldur's Gate series, where you have the main objective, but along the way, you could maybe branch out and do some side stories that might give the characters XP or some type of world knowledge or experience that they might not know of. And then if characters like, well, I'm going to punch this guy, and in real life they are kind of very hot-headed, I have to say, do you really want to do this? While the party sits there at the table drinking, and the people in real life sit there groaning because they know that something's going to happen that, isn't really going to, play out right. But you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, almost definitely. When did you know that you had a love for world building? When did it sort of infect you?
Probably after the first couple D&D sessions I had where I wasn't because I started with somebody else DMing my first few sessions. I knew right then, and because I was big into sci-fi and fantasy and stuff like that, and great movies like Star Wars and things of that nature, that I knew I wanted to try to make my own world and populate it with characters. So pretty much right after I did my first few sessions with my buddy DMing, that I sat back and was like, okay, I want to step back and make my own world for people to kind of adventure in.
Now, just to get a feeling from you as a connoisseur of geekery,
mm-hmm.
A lot of times people think of world building and they know what it means, which is two different things. But, they think about world building, they think Tolkien, Middle Earth or Pern, or, obviously
mm-hmm.
Star Wars or Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
How underrated do you think D&D's worlds are to all of today's world builders?
Oh, D&D will always be kind of the end all be all of our RPGs, and Tolkien will be kind of like the end all be all of fantasy, and Star Wars is kind of like end all be all of sci-fi. Unfortunately for Dungeons and Dragons, it's painted in a negative light sometimes, and And then you get long gaps or periods of time where they haven't released a new edition, and people might not play it or even know about it, and it might fall out of the vernacular. So when you have worlds like Dragonlance, which started out as regular Dungeons and Dragons and grew into this thing, a lot of people know Dragonlance, and a lot of people know who Drizzt Do'Urden is or who Raistlin is, and but sometimes when you say things like the Red Wizards of Thay, that's kind of, you're going to like a level that might not be that known. And I think that a good thing for Dungeons and Dragons, a pro of it is the framework is there to lay down the ground rules, and it's so open. It's like open source RPG. You can put your people into a world that has, some ties with pre-established Dungeons and Dragons worlds. But then again, you can do whatever you want with it. You get stuff like Pools of Radiance, the old Gold Box SSI games and stuff like that, which were very much set in the realms that TSR wanted to create. And but I think that over time, a lot of people forget about stuff like that. You don't really have Dragon Magazine around anymore as this juggernaut of, here's what we're doing, we're building worlds, here's advice, put things into our world, and journey with these big named gods and wizards and everything that we've created for you. So I think that a lot of people like to do their own thing with Dungeons and Dragons, whereas if you're going to do an RPG of, say, Star Wars, the characters are going to want to meet somebody famous from the lore, Hey, Luke Skywalker shows up and gives the party some information on something, and then they go off on their way. But with Dungeons and Dragons, you can just have them fight a dragon that is unknown only to you. You've made it up, and they can walk away feeling like they've made their own, adventure that's heroic and will always be memorable.
Now, from a role-playing perspective, have you ever journeyed outside of the realm? Because that's one of the problems they have, too, is there's so many, especially with like all of the indie games coming out now, there are so many variants of role-playing games. Some have their own settings. Some are completely world agnostic, and others, have worlds. So I mean, does Wizards of the Coast ever become what D&D was? Do you think?
It's tough to say. For me personally, I've never really tried to, get beyond, adventuring in a certain realm or whatever. But we did a long time ago. I wasn't the DM, someone else was, and we did a search for the Rod of Seven Parts, which is a D&D artifact. And the DM actually put us into different other products from TSR. We went to Gamma World. We went to a few other places by using time travel and portals and magic and stuff. And we brought it into a modern day setting. We brought it into fantasy, sci-fi, all over the place to really kind of make this giant soup of a RPG session, which was jarring in some ways, but kind of cool in others, because beyond just journeying in those worlds, we actually used rules. Like for Gamma World, we got mutations. We fought creatures, robots and cyborgs and stuff that really were nasty with lasers and things. So, it was kind of cool to step beyond just the token vernacular type world of, if you're playing fantasy, to mix it up and throw some other things in,
So when it comes to fantasy, do you think right now, and maybe this is Token's fault, and we can blame him for it, because that's so iconic, but
yeah,
do fantasy writers have trouble getting past medieval times?
Yeah, for sure. I think these days you see, either two, for me, it's two things. It's either that Tolkien-esque world of elves hate dwarves and man is struggling, that kind of thing, or you get this other end of things where it's all human-centric, and they try to play it where it's just human-based kind of stuff with magic thrown in, there's warring nations per se kind of thing. Something like along the lines of Song of Ice and Fire, which it has, if you were to watch the HBO show or even read the books, it could be very much real life medieval based type stuff. And then there's folklore of these White Walkers or others beyond the wall. And there's a little bit of magic, but it's more like science, like the green fire and stuff like that. Where I think he plays it kind of,
It's like historical fiction, but with different names.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Like kings backstabbing other kings and politics and stuff like that. Yeah, so I think that, they tend to fall into those two camps and they're safe. I don't find I haven't really read enough of those works that fit in between those two, kind of, baselines for fantasy, role-playing and novel, writing and stuff like that, where, sometimes you'll see someone come along and mix in a little bit of tech with the fantasy, and that kind of treads, in this other direction. But for the most part, Tolkien is just, it's tough to break away from his gravity well, and just go and do something else because everybody knows and loves that stuff.
Yeah, it's like you're surfing around the black hole.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
No, okay. So now, like you said, you're working on your own now, and a lot of people don't understand, one, the kind of courage it takes to sort of break off on your own. But a lot of people sit back, like me for years, sitting at home, running role-playing games or doing nothing because I don't have any time because I'm working and I'm playing video games when I come home. Mm-hmm. But what was that I can moment where you said, you know what? I can make that struggle. I can make that step into trying. Now, obviously, as a graphic artist, you did it. Like I said, you're building a lot of mini worlds in with that.
Yeah.
But still, that's doing it, and it could be used for people who want to write books. It could be used for anyone. What was that I can moment that you had?
It was pretty much when I decided to move to Boston, about a year and a half ago I moved out there and I said, you know what, if I move, I'm going to make this, leap to do freelancing. And at the time, I do a lot of, conventions, comic book conventions, gaming conventions, anime conventions and stuff like that where I sell as a vendor. And at the time I was lining up all these conventions. I said, between all these conventions that I'm doing and the fact that I have interest in my posters, I'm going to try to do this on my own and see how well I can do and not have to suffer eating ramen. That's my only dietary intake. So yeah, it was that moment when I realized that my Etsy store was a viable business and doing all these conventions. And it really kind of came together after that, starting to get, some big projects from some big name people, starting to do book covers and stuff like that. So that it all just, but that one moment was like, I'm moving. I'm going to try to do this based off these two things. Let's just go for it.
So one thing I have to bring up, and there have been many moments like being a friend of yours where I've seen, I've been like, wow, that's awesome. Wow, that's awesome. But one for me, and this is sort of a little bit from world building, was the Supremacy Project.
Oh,
Classic war game. What did you tell yourself when they asked you that, they wanted you to do graphic art material to redo a classic strategy game?
It's funny because I pursued them. One of my good buddies came to me and said, "Hey, Aaron, there's a Kickstarter project on Kickstarter, of course, for Supremacy. They're trying to reboot it." And I went and I looked at it, and at the time they wanted $30,000, and they had a few days left. And I looked at the art direction and the design, and not to sound egotistical, but it wasn't cohesive and coherent. And it didn't make for a good overall experience visually, I thought. So I said, you know what? This project is probably not going to get its funding. Let me contact this person and say, hey, if you pay me, I will do this for you because this game is very near and dear to my heart. And lo and behold, the guy got back to me and said, yeah, we'll hire you. We worked out a price negotiation and I dove in right to it. And I made some pretty bold design choices that a lot of people didn't agree with, but he did, and a bunch of other people did. And I'm happy to report that I just saw a project update the other day, and things are really trucking along with this project now. It was kind of in limbo for a while they were working out some logistical issues, but now everything's rolling right along. So it's kind of cool to take a classic game like that and to reimagine and repurpose some pieces from it, but in a new style, like the old school mushroom clouds that they had in it. I designed a new mushroom cloud for it. It's kind of tweaked a couple of the pieces that were in the original game, the look of the money and things like that. You know, you want to give a little bit of a nod to those things, like maybe the colors used on the money, but you want to make it your own. You want to give it that unique look, and especially the logo. The old classic Supremacy bird logo was really very cool and modern for its time. The whole look of the old game from the 80s was. So when I wanted to come up with something, I drew a lot on, just this hard edge fantasy sci-fi kind of, I came up with this, we call it the warbird, this angular looking bird with missiles grasped in its talons kind of look, face on. And I think it really encompassed that hardcore kind of, okay, we're going to nuke the world, and we're going to maybe mess with the economy while we're getting there kind of aspect of the game. So yeah, it was very cool though.
The bird, definitely would challenge any Mockingjay out there. All right. So what would you say your biggest achievement is to date?
Oh, my biggest achievement to date. Probably selling, probably close to about 10,000 pieces of my art. Between conventions and Etsy, there are like 6,000 of my 10,000 of my posters out there. My Etsy store alone is getting close to 6,000 sold. So I'm humbled by the fact that people all over the world, I've shipped to Australia, to Japan, to Russia, to England, Germany, Iceland, all over the world own my art. And it's up in dorms and businesses and living rooms and kids' rooms everywhere, which is kind of cool. So I think that that's my biggest achievement so far.
Now, if you could have given yourself one piece of real world advice, something where you could go back to the beginning, it could be to your birth if you want to, but you probably wouldn't listen. Go back, let's say, to the beginning when you started this process. Yeah. What piece of advice would you give yourself?
Oh, wow. There's been a few projects that I've worked on where I should have said to the client, give me a down payment. I mean, if we're going to keep things basic, really basic and go along those lines, because everybody has a laundry list of things they'd love to say to their past lives, like, don't take this job or don't date this person or whatever. But I think when it all comes down to it, something simple along the business line of things would be, hey, art is a business, and you have to learn to charge people for your art. That's a fair price, and you should get paid for it. So take a moment before you do this project for somebody and say, hey, am I getting fairly compensated? Are they receiving a quality product that's worth the money? And treat it like a job rather than just like, I draw pretty pictures for somebody and no one's ever going to pay me for this thing. People will pay you for your art as long as you treat it professionally. Treat your customers like they're real people and like they're business clients. Give them, stay within deadlines and stuff like that. But it's a job. You got to treat it like a job. It's fun. Treat it like fun, but also know underlying the whole thing, it's a job. Pay your taxes, all that stuff. So there you go.
Yeah. That's where the advice I had for you was going to be don't watch Matrix 2.
Oh, why didn't I listen?
Now, tell a quick story of something that could have got you started early.
Oh, okay. Well, growing up, I always wanted to do a comic book, and I met my partner in crime, my buddy Tom, way back when we were working at Riverside, which is, for those people that don't know who Riverside is, it's an amusement park that still exists, but Six Flags bought it. And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. We wanted to do a comic book. We both did. So we teamed up to do a comic book, but it took us like 13 years before we finally put that comic book out. Just being lazy and life getting in the way and just kind of rebooting the thing over and over and over again until we got where we said, hey, we're going to draw 20-something pages of art, put it together, and self-publish this thing. And part of the impetus was I was working at a print shop at the time. So I had all the tools in place. I could draw, he wrote, he scripted, our buddy colored, and we put it all together, got it printed professionally. And that all came together into an issue. And then we put 2 other issues out, but I would have started that sooner, even if it was 5 or 6 years sooner, and got the ball rolling a little bit sooner on that if we could have.
Now, would you say part of that is those, or sort of like those voices that say, oh, no one's going to pay for your art. There's no market for you out there. Is that part of it?
A little bit. When you look at we're talking late 80s, early 90s here when, Marvel was in its heyday with its X-Men issues. They were putting out a new X-Men line every week. Valiant, was huge with like Exo Manowar and stuff like that. Image was huge. McFarlane ruled the roost. Rob Liefeld was everywhere. You couldn't turn around without them putting out a new title, every week. So it was almost like, do we want to put this thing out because we're going to get buried? There were a lot. This was kind of the rise of the indies too. People who said, Image struck out from, these other comic book companies and said, we're going to do our own thing. Everybody and their brother was starting to do their own thing. This is the same time that everyone was doing like a web comic, like around that time. So it was more of a fear we would get lost in the crowd and lost in the shuffle. So we really had to come up with something special and unique that would set us apart. That was one big fear though, was, hey, we're going to get lost amongst all these other people.
I remember that time very fondly. I lost so much money. I didn't really lose it, but there were so many good comic books out, and the Marvel and DC were flooding the market to try and eat up the shelf space. It was a golden age for comic books.
It was. You'll never see a time like that again. It was excess. It was polybagged with a card and a chromium cover and all this stuff. It's crazy. I see a little bit of it here and there these days, but it was glutton. It was everywhere. There was so much of it back then.
That's right. If it only had one chromium cover instead of 4 or 5 different colors of chromium. You
crazy.
got the black, not the silver one. That's just not as good.
I know, it's not. This one's worth $200. This one's worth $50. You made a bad call.
I remember all my early Valiant comic books. I looked at one of those magazines like a year or so after they had opened up, and I was like the next Bill Gates. And 10 years later, I think they might have lost a little value.
Yeah, just a little.
All right. So now we are going to enter the gauntlet round. So this is a round where I'm going to ask you questions. I will not throw gauntlets at you because I'm too lazy. But you just got to answer them one sentence as quick as you can. First thing off the top of your head. Okay. What held you back from sharing your worlds?
Just fear that people wouldn't like them.
Favorite type of fantasy worlds? Alien, Earth-like, or Earth-based?
Earth-based.
What is your favorite time period for fantasy settings?
Probably, if I'm going to go with something, Time of Dragons, time of high fantasy and magic.
Magic and dragons. Huh?
Magic and dragons.
Can't argue with that. Let's see. What is the most important habit or skill in creating a world?
Believability. You have to have it so your players are going to believe that the world that they're in.
What tool could you not work without?
A pencil.
That's the artist talking. Let's see. What is one resource you would offer to a world builder starting down your path?
The internet. I'm not offering it to them, but it's there. Use it.
Yeah. You're not ISP.
Yep.
We call it Aaron Fiber. If you ended up in a world you created, going back to your DM days,
yep,
what would be the first thing you would do if you woke up in?
Go look for my castle that I built for my high-level character. And seek refuge.
Yeah, and hope they're nicer to you than to some of the NPCs.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, well, Aaron, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to share an interview with me. If people want to learn more about you, how do they follow you on this wacky thing called the internet?
Oh, well, you're going to have to summon me through magical and mystic means, and then I'll show up at your place, we'll have a drink, and then maybe I can answer some of your questions. No, if you want to find out where I dwell online, you can find me on Etsy. If you look up my shop name, which is Just One Scarf, JUSTONESTARF, Just One Scarf. You can find me on Google Plus. I'm there on Google Plus. If you look for Aaron Wood, I'm the guy with like 200,000 followers, blah, blah, blah. And if you, cause there's actually like 8 or 9 of us on there. So you got to find the right one. And you can find, me on, I have a Facebook fan page, that's listed just under my name, Aaron Wood. And you can find me in any of those 3 places. Also, you can check out, sometimes I do writing and I do another podcast every week for the Geek League of America. So if you want to go to geekleagueofamerica.com, you can find me there. We're actually recording a podcast after this tonight.
Well, excellent. That's very good. And the important thing, if you love geekness, this is a fun podcast to listen to. So beyond other things, definitely want to listen to this podcast and rate and review it on iTunes as well, along with mine.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And soon to be on Google Streams, I hear. Just not positive there, but perhaps.
Perhaps.
Okay. All right. So now, for everyone out there, go show Aaron some thanks. Go to his Etsy shop. Go look through his propaganda posters and some of the work he's ever done. He's done book covers for Alien Survival Guides. Do you list your book covers up there too, or do you not have samples of those up there?
They're in a separate place. If you want to check out my Behance portfolio, which is most of all the work that I've done, you can find me at behance.net/Aaron Wood. And that's my online portfolio of just about all my book covers, logos, and stuff like that I've done.
If you check out that portfolio, go over, buy some bacon and coffee propaganda from his Etsy shop. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.